Hello and welcome to this Careers in Engagement panel event. Today I'm joined by Hanna Yube, Rachel Edwards, Peter Thorley and Lisa Ford. I'll get everybody to kind of introduce themselves properly in a minute and kind of what they do and kind of their background in engagement. But I just want to start off by introducing myself. So I'm Naomi Kay. I work for Warwick Institute of Engagement and my role here is about getting more people to do public engagement across the university. So I organise lots of our training events. I teach a module in IATL on public engagement, which kind of lots of other people at the university help as well, including Rachel. We'll talk about that in a second. And I also have kind of come from a background of organising events for the university. So I've organised various kind of campus festivals, both here and at the previous institution I worked for, which was Bournemouth University. And kind of have done lots of different things in terms of planning events for different audiences and different people to kind of get them involved with different kinds of research. So that is me. So what I'm going to go do is just kind of go around, ask everybody to introduce themselves. If you could just kind of tell us a little bit about what your job is. And then if I could also get you just to sum up what your job is in 3 words. So I'm going to go around the screen as I can see you. So I'm going to start with you, Hanna.
Thanks, Naomi. I'm Hanna Yube. I'm a freelance science communicator and illustrator, and that encompasses lots of different things. So producing events, speaking, co-hosting a podcast, training researchers, doing consultancy, and doing lots of drawing as well. The 3 words thing is quite challenging, so I'm going to go for a list of art, science, and events. No, and.
Oh, nice. Very nice, thank you. And then Rachel, do you want to go next?
Okay, hi, I'm Rachel. I'm an academic at Warwick. I'm in the physics department and I've been here for quite a while now. So my job is mostly research and teaching, looking at uses of ultrasound. But I've also started doing quite a lot of outreach as I've got further through my career. So I do things like Christmas lectures, I go out to schools, and it's all about being the person that I needed, someone who was stupidly enthusiastic about science and an example of someone who could go through and do a career in science. And my 3 words are research, teaching, more.
Lovely, thank you. Peter, do you want to go next?
I do. So can everyone hear me okay, by the way?
We can, yes, thank
Brilliant.
you.
I'm a media relations manager for the University of Warwick. My particular area is, or specialist area here is the medical school and physics. So although as a press officer, I kind of be expected to cover quite a wide variety of areas, those are 2 particular areas that I focus on, largely because that focus allows us to kind of build up contacts and build up a good kind of background knowledge of those particular areas, which helps us when we're engaging with the media. Obviously, engagement from our perspective is slightly different from others in that we're not usually engaging with the public directly. We're engaging via a kind of intermediary in the form of the media. But there are some very similar principles at work here. I say I've worked for Warwick for 3 years today, funnily enough, and worked at the University of Leicester in a similar role for 10 years. And I say every day is different. It never ceases to amaze me what comes out of this university. 3 words, as you probably find later on in the session, I think the only 3 words I can think of for my job is a lot of pressure.
Thank you very much. And then Lisa.
Hello, and thank you for having me along today. So I'm Lisa Ford and I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager for Culture Coventry. So that's the trust that manages the Herbert Art Gallery and Museum, Coventry Transport Museum and the Lunt Roman Fort. My role here is to manage the learning team, and that's made up of a whole team of people, from learning officers who deliver on our schools and family programme to our community engagement officers, and we'll have learning assistants who help to support our delivery and planning of our activity as well. But yeah, we work across all different audiences, and we do that both on site at the museum and out in the community as well. So we do a lot of events out at community centres, and we've recently been in parks. So my 3 words to sum all of this up are varied, energetic and busy, because that definitely describes everything that we do on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that one. I think everybody has always got so much on. Okay, so thank you for that, everyone. What I'm going to then kind of get you to kind of start to talk about first then is what made you want to choose this as a career path? How did you start working in engagement? And I'm going to come to Rachel first, if that's okay. So talking about it from the academic perspective.
Yeah, so my career path, the obvious choice was go and do research. I enjoyed my subject when I was an undergraduate and wasn't finished with it by the end of my degree. So I went on to do more research and a PhD, still enjoyed it, carried on with it. The engagement side is something that I do as an addition. So when you do an academic career, you do your research, you do your teaching and a little bit of admin. But the outreach and engagement is really important for us. And partly as scientists, it's to go, this is what we're doing, this is what we're spending public money on. It's useful. It might not be useful right now, but it's going to be useful for these sorts of things later down the line. Also trying to persuade people that they might enjoy this subject. And for physics particularly, there's quite an emphasis on encouraging women to study physics and saying it is for other people, it is for everyone. Here are examples of different people who are working in science. It's not just all old men with lab coats and funny hair. So my push was to go in and just be that person that I'd needed, as I said before, enthusiastic about science, but also showing that a wide variety of different people can do science.
Brilliant, thank you. And Hannah, how does that kind of compare with you, because you have a science background as well?
Yes, I do. I think similarly to Rachel, I wasn't done with science, but I couldn't pick a particular area. I loved all of it and didn't want to leave any of it behind. So I had quite a windy path. I thought I was going to end up in business and then ended up working for a medical charity, discovered science communication whilst I was there. And then after about 7 years working for various sort of science organizations, I ended up going freelance. And I very much thought I'd left my art side sort of locked somewhere when I was 18 and felt very, very lucky to be able to bring that back in. And I've now been freelance for 3.5 years and have slowly been sort of bringing in more and more art into what I do, which I really, really love.
Brilliant. So yeah, a bit more of a kind of weaving path there, perhaps.
Yeah, it's been a very windy path.
And then Peter, what about you?
Well, to be honest, when I first left university, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, and I think I had a certain ambition to become a journalist, which was never actually realised. So because I didn't take that route, I kind of became naturally attracted towards a role working with press relations. And there was a convenient role available at University of Leicester at the time. And obviously, as I said earlier, I've spent a good 10 years there, progressing, but also learning tricks of the trade, the nature of the profession, and getting a good kind of a good idea of how a university worked at the same time. So my kind of route into this was a little bit haphazard, it must be said. But once there were so many opportunities to learn. There's always something going off at university. There's always new research coming out. There are always new initiatives, new outreach efforts and activities, etc. that you're never bored for a second. And before long, for me, I kind of found this is the perfect out for me. I put journalism behind me and decided that actually here's where all the exciting stuff is happening. Here's where I get to write about cutting edge science, get to talk about some challenging arts projects, where we get to talk about some great initiatives that make an impact on people's real lives. And from that, really, I was hooked.
Brilliant. And then last but not least, so Lisa, how did you get into working in museums?
So for me, it was kind of an unexpected path as well. So when I was at school, art was always my passion. That was the key subject for me, and it was where I thrived. And so once I'd finished my A-levels, that's what I went off to explore. I went to university. I did my foundation in art and design, and then I did my degree in fine art, and still absolutely loved art throughout it. And as I was at university, I always knew I'd never wanted to be an artist, though. So as much as I loved making art, I definitely didn't want a career as an artist. For me personally, I didn't like the instability of it. And so I applaud everybody who is confident enough to go with that. But I wanted something more solid to go towards as a career, that was a bit more reliable. So I was thinking teaching, because I've always loved working with children. And so my plan was to become an art teacher, and that was my plan right up to my third year of my degree. And I was so certain of my career path. And whilst I was doing my third year of the degree, I did a longer placement at a secondary school. And that opened my eyes up to the realities of becoming a secondary art teacher, and it put me off completely. So again, I applaud everybody who does it. I think that secondary teachers, they are made of tough stuff, and I know many of them in my personal life. My own sister is one, and I think she is just so geared up to it, and it's an absolute calling. But for me, it took away from the passion of the subject, because there were students there who didn't care about art, and that's not what they wanted to be learning about. Whereas I wanted to be with those who were really, passionate about it too. So I went to one of my lecturers at university with this problem that I was then facing, this all of a sudden career crisis, because I was so set on what my path was going to be. And she said, well, have you ever considered teaching in a museum? And I'd never considered that. And then it got me thinking. And so she was the one who led me down that path. So once I finished my degree, I went off to University of Leicester to do my museum studies masters. And that was just an
Okay, you've cut out. Hopefully you'll reappear in a second. I think that's a really interesting point, actually, talking about doing placements as a great way to kind of gain experience in these careers. I think, for me, I did my degree in event management at Bournemouth University, and as part of that, I had to do a year-long placement. And I spent all year looking and wasn't very successful in kind of finding something. And then kind of in the last sort of couple of months, before kind of the deadline, I found a position working for the university, organising their on-campus public engagement festival. And I had a brilliant year, getting involved with kind of lots of different people's research, and kind of doing a job which, compared to a lot of the kind of other events industry roles that were out there, was a lot better paid and has a lot better benefits and a lot better work-life balance. So for me, I was sold. I was like, university is the way to go. So yeah, I would really recommend, if you can, doing a placement, not necessarily a year, but any kind of short-term placement, so you can kind of get to grips with what an industry is actually like before you go into it, is always a brilliant idea.
Yeah, I got into doing this by working with people in the department who were already doing outreach and getting invited along, helping out with open days and various school visits, and just getting that experience.
One of the things I would that we often, one of the bits of advice we'd often give to people who particularly want to work with the media, or particularly want to take up a career with journalism, is that it's actually quite vital to get that early experience. A lot of it voluntary, a lot of it in the form of things like placements or internships. But certainly for something like journalism, you need to kind of be. Employers really look for that kind of knowledge and that understanding of the actual industry, the craft of putting together, reporting on a story, gathering information, putting together your content, delivering for a deadline, moving on to the next story. There's a very strong kind of process to it. And a lot of that you won't gain from just sitting at home reading about it, or and obviously at university you write a lot of essays, but it's not always quite the same thing. You need to go out and get get that hands-on experience, whatever way you can, and it's valuable experience that also follows on into communications roles, such as that of a press officer. Those skills of delivering stuff to deadlines under pressure, etc., are kind of very vital for this kind of industry.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So I'm going to ask now, what's the most interesting project you've ever worked on? So Peter, you mentioned earlier you've kind of looked at lots of different things over your time kind of here at Warwick and at Leicester. So do you have a standout that was the most interesting?
For myself, it's very difficult to not answer that question without mentioning working on the discovery of Richard III, the remains of Richard III in Leicester. It'd be about nearly 10 years ago now. Which, as you can imagine, is extremely exciting and quite a fascinating project we've been involved in. But one of the interesting elements to it, though, was the way that was very much a project that resonated with the local population. It was probably one of the most public-facing projects I've ever been involved in, because there was such a strong public interest in it. And the knock-on effect of it was that I've obviously worked at the University of Leicester. I still live in Leicester now. I'm broadcasting to you live from Leicester, so I could see firsthand how the local community kind of rallied around this whole project, the fascination they had. We joked about how soon after we announced the discovery of the remains, every shop in the city centre all of a sudden was using Richard III to kind of, as in its advertising. It was just absolutely everywhere, and that for me was extremely rewarding, because it was seeing something I was involved with, even if only in a kind of minor tangential way almost. Seeing that actually affect people's lives, seeing the enthusiasm that people brought to it. And for years afterwards, we found at Leicester that there was a real appetite for archaeology stories in the local newspapers, for example. We had a few archaeological digs that our archaeologists did in the years following that got huge numbers of visitors when they did outreach activities. There was just this real, Richard III kind of really ignited this real enthusiasm in the local population for that kind of story, for finding out more about the history of where we live. And that was extremely rewarding for me, particularly as a press officer, someone who sits in the background, doesn't just necessarily. You don't go in. You don't become a press officer for the glory. It's other people who are writing about your stories. It's not you who gets it gets all the fame. But seeing the general public firsthand, have a real enthusiasm for this story and all the stuff that followed it. That made my job feel particularly rewarding at that time.
I can imagine, definitely. I can't believe that was 10 years ago.
Neither can I.
I think that came to me there. Oh, Lisa, would you like to tell us about the most, interesting thing that's kind of the most interesting project you've ever worked on?
Yes, and I'm sorry that it cut out. Technology is just awful. But yes, most interesting. This was a really tough one to choose from, I'll be honest. But I'm also going to go back around 10 years to a Diamond Jubilee project that we ran here at the Herbert. So we were working with a local primary school, but also a local care home. And it was to celebrate the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. We'd received a small pot of funding from Heritage Lottery Fund to deliver an intergenerational project. And so working with a care home, we delivered some reminiscence sessions with them using objects from the collections that were all celebrating royal occasions, right from Queen Victoria's time up to modern day. But we also engaged with a local primary school who were just across the road from the care home, so within walking distance. And we delivered a very similar activity with them, looking at the objects and thinking about the history of the royal family. So introducing the children who were in year 4 at the time, so 8-9 years old, to members of the royal family that they'd never even heard of outside of the king and queen, even though he wasn't a king, but that's how they all referred to him. And it was a nice way to bring a little bit of history to them. But then we integrated the two. So we took, after building up the relationship at the care home and then at the primary school, we invited primary school children into the care home, and there they sat with the older people. We had an afternoon tea, and they just listened to the older people telling stories of their royal memories, and then the children were kind of telling all of these older people about their thoughts on the royal family, which was so polar opposite to what the older generation had. But it was just lovely. And then from building up that relationship, because we repeated a similar activity with this same group of older people and primary children a few times, so they really got to know each other. And then we took them all off to the Emma Bridgewater factory in Stoke-on-Trent, where they all had a tour of the factory, but then we took part in a pottery workshop, so they all made their own royal souvenir mug as well. And then we had a big celebration event at the museum for the Diamond Jubilee, where we held a street party for them. So it was just a really lovely, fun-filled project for the two generations to come together. And what was really nice for us as a museum was that the legacy to it was that school continued to go into the care home following on from that, to build up relationships with the older people. And there's been so much research and so many findings about how older people being exposed to young children, and just for the chatter and the playfulness and the craft activities that they can do together, supports their mental well-being so much that I think it gave real legacy to that project. So that was lovely to be a part of. And the children all wrote to the Queen as well to tell them about the project, and they got a response. So for them, that was just the highlight of their lives. And when I've been thinking back, I cannot believe it's almost 10 years, because it's now almost time for the Platinum Jubilee.
Yes, hopefully. Yeah. Oh, hopefully, yeah. Oh, brilliant. That sounds like an amazing project. Just for anybody kind of watching online, feel free to kind of start asking us your own questions just in the comments as we're going along, and we'll come to those shortly. Hanna, do you want to share the most exciting project you've ever worked on?
Yeah. So my answer to this probably changes about once a month, but I'll go with the current answer, which is I recently worked with the Neuroergonomics Conference, which is, I'm going to hopefully explain this correctly, but where sort of neuroscience collides with life, so work, education, the home, health. And they brought me on to design a colouring page inspired by each of their sessions, so their sort of keynote talks and their plenaries. And I learned so much, because I sort of watched all of the conference videos at least once, some twice, and then had quite a lot of fun sort of figuring out, how to represent these talks visually. And in some cases, there were quite literal and obvious sort of images. In other cases, it was a bit more abstract and required quite a lot of thought. And it was a really fun project. It was really interesting. But for me, it also felt like the sort of project that really sort of sums up what I do and why I do it. So I occasionally get comments like, oh, you're wasting your science degree by doing illustration. I'm like, no, I'm using my science degree whenever I do illustration. And I'm quite often producing illustrations that someone who did not have that scientific understanding would be able to. So that was a really nice, rewarding project to be involved with.
Sounds amazing. And then, Rachel, what's the most exciting thing you've blown up so far? Come on.
I've got a bit of a reputation for blowing things up now. Normally intended in lectures. I guess the most exciting one has to be the Warwick Christmas lectures, which is something that we run every single year. And it's grown from just being in the physics department, and it started in one year with just the single lecture. And then the next year, there were 3 of them, and 2 of them were sensible, proper research talks. And then there was the one that I was involved in, which was an excuse for throwing around liquid nitrogen, doing experiments, and having a bit of fun. So they've now grown from being in the normal lecture theatres on campus to, we went into the Art Centre a few years ago and had the theatre space, which meant that we had an audience of about 500. And then they've moved the last few years into the Butterworth Hall. So there's about 1,100 people come along. There's 2 evenings in the run up to Christmas, and a bunch of scientists and other special guests just being enthusiastic and having a great amount of fun on stage in front of all these people. And it's reaching a huge number. If I'm allowed to, though, the other project that I really love is going out to primary schools. And a lot of academics will go and talk to secondary schools because those are the ones who have got a bit more knowledge, so we can talk at a higher level. They're the ones that we want to go and advertise to say come to this university or choose this subject. But I love going and talking to primary school students, and it's partly because they're so over enthusiastic about it, so I feel like we match each other quite well. But also it's a huge challenge working out how do you talk about science, how do you talk about research, but at a level that primary school children can follow. I love that challenge.
Nice. Okay, so on that theme then, what's the most challenging thing you've ever come across working in this field? Who wants to start? Does anybody have any good thoughts on that?
I'm happy to pitch in there.
Go with you, Lisa. Yeah.
So to be honest, it's just ongoing things within the arts and cultural sector. It's budget, capacity to do stuff. That's like the ongoing challenges that we face really across the museums world, because budgets are often on a shoestring, or you're forever scrabbling around trying to get external funding in order to, get the bigger projects off the ground, get the bigger engagement programs off the ground and the exhibitions. But it's all very time consuming. It's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of reporting that then is involved with it as well. So I think with engagement activity, whether that's for families, schools, adults, from the outside, it always looks very, very fun. And it is, and that's definitely the highlight of the career choice, really. The actual engagement with the people, it makes everything worth it. However, there is a lot of legwork that goes on behind it. It's not always easy. There's a lot of hurdles that you have to overcome. You have to be very creative in your thinking sometimes in order to make something big happen. And like I say, often I'm quite a shoestring budget. But then it also comes down to capacity. One of my words that I use to describe my working life is busy. We are busy. We're a small team of people, but we're a very ambitious team of people. So we struggle to say no to things when opportunities come our way because we're so passionate about what we do. And there's so much joy in what we do that we don't want to say no, but actually it's checking in with ourselves sometimes over the realities of what do people want from us, but what actually can we give them? And then thinking about our audiences of, well, what is it they want and need from us? And actually, we should be working more towards what the audience wants rather than what the expectations of us are. So yeah, there's definitely challenges along the way, but I think just having that reality check every now and then helps to keep things in line.
Yeah, definitely. I can see everyone nodding along as they agree with that. Yeah, I think it's something that's always really, so from a university perspective as well, like a lot of what we do is kind of put in funding bids to run projects as well. And there's always a small part of me that's like, what if we get this and then we're going to have to deliver all of this massive project and how are we going to fit that in? But it's always so exciting kind of as you're kind of planning for new big things coming up. Hannah, I don't know if you've got anything that you'd like to share.
Yeah, could I have two on slightly different scales? Yeah. So I guess like at a career level, there's the challenge of almost feeling like there's no defined path and I'm almost making it up as I go along. And I mean, that's especially true for freelancers, but I think a lot of people in engagement are like that. There's, everyone is sort of choosing the next step and there isn't a defined ladder, which can be quite difficult, but also is a massive opportunity as well, because lots of people take quite interesting routes and different routes. I guess on a more sort of day-to-day level, probably one of the most challenging things I do is sort of that on-the-ground event management at festivals and other events. So Naomi, you and me have done that side by side before, but you literally get sort of everything thrown at you live whilst trying to make the event seem as smooth as possible to everyone who's actually attending. And that is a very tough environment, but a very rewarding one to be in as well.
Definitely. It really makes you think on your feet, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Rachel, have you got one you'd like to share?
Yeah, mine is pretty much the same as Lisa's. But it's all about being able to find the time and the budget for doing this. So on an academic career, the standard thing has always been you're judged on your research and your teaching, and anything else that you do is just an added extra that you do for the fun of it. But it's starting to change. So the outreach and engagement is being taken into account more now when we start looking at promotions, and there's quite a few of the funding bodies are doing small pots of money for us that you can apply for to be able to run engagement projects.
Yeah, definitely. Because with kind of engagement projects, there's sort of whole different scales of things you can do, aren't there? Like you can do kind of just a kind of talk to people, that's perhaps quite cheap to run. But then, yeah, when you want to go do bigger, more exciting things, then they can kind of run into sort of tens of thousands when you really get going. Peter, have you got a kind of key challenge that comes up in your role?
I've got lots. I think I might be the only person here who might not list budget among them. Since sending press releases to journalists is a relatively cheap cheap thing to do. But I mean, the challenge for us is first off is being able to get that cut through to journalists. First of all, you've got to be able to sell a story to the media. And of course, it's, not everything that comes your way is going to be something that's going to excite the media. It's not something that's necessarily going to fit in the news agenda. So it's that initial challenge of actually getting cut through in the first place. And there's also reaction, because one of our big challenges is that we're working through an intermediary, i.e. the media. And they are the ones who are dealing more directly with the audience we want to get through to. So once we hand over a story to them, we are very much in their hands as to what they actually do with the final product. And there are plenty of horror stories out there of stories being twisted around by the media and research being misrepresented, etc. It happens less frequently than people might think. But there's an added pressure on us to try and manage that, to try and make sure kind of manage the reaction to that, and particularly when it concerns particularly controversial stories. So for us, it's very much that kind of, it's a very risky kind of industry that we work in. When you put a story out to the media, you never quite know what's going to happen with it, and you've got to have kind of almost like an arsenal of tools available to kind of help manage that. Sometimes quite on the fly. And I mean, this is rather why I started off this whole session with my 3 words to describe my job, which is too much pressure. Which is this is what it is. There's an awful lot of pressure on you when you were putting that story out. Pressure to make sure it gets coverage, pressure to make sure that it's the right sort of coverage, pressure to make sure it's not a bad reaction, etc. So it does get quite tense, the role. But the reward from it, when you see a story hit it big, when you see the sort of reaction you can get to a popular story, one that the media go absolutely ape for, is fantastic. And you certainly from the very earliest part of my career, just the fact that I could wander into the newsagents and see a story that I've been involved with, or one of the newspapers sitting on the shelves there. If I'd go down to the pub and on the TV, see the news and see one of my stories there, that's a fantastic feeling. That real sense that you've made an impact on people's lives, because it's even for yourself as you go about your day-to-day life, you're seeing that news out there, and that's the buzz, shall I say, that I would get as a press officer.
Yeah. I guess another interesting thing that might kind of have sort of changed over the course of your career is kind of how social media and the news have changed. I don't know if you've got anything you could kind of talk about with that, perhaps. I
can. I mean, I think there's a lesson to take, certainly for anyone wanting to enter my particular profession, my industry, from that, which is that how quickly things can change. I have distinct memories of not long after I started my career at university, of us sitting down in a meeting and actually asking, well, shall we should we set the university up with an account on this Facebook thing that they were talking about? And it was only a few months later that we had a student intern in to ask whether we wanted to do that Twitter thing as well. It just this is only 12, 13 years ago, and all of a sudden, in that shorter space of time, it's social media dominates just about everything these days. Now, the media is still an important part of kind of public communications. You know, a lot of people are still getting their news from traditional media sources, and a lot more than you might necessarily think. And they are changing their ways of working to kind of take advantage of social media more. So in some ways, there's not quite a direct split between traditional media and social media, as is often seen. But social media is not only a key way that people are getting their news now, it's also driving the news agenda a lot more. You know, a single comment on social media can be enough to spark a whole new aspect of the news agenda. So it's an additional challenge, and I think we haven't quite seen just how powerful social media can be in terms of public communications yet. I think we're still in reasonably early days. But I would certainly say anyone who wants to enter this kind of industry, definitely press relations, communications, likely. It would do you a lot of good to understand how social media works, the kind of on the technical level and at a more kind of, say, academic level, because it's becoming vital for communications now, and having that solid understanding would do very well in this sort of career today.
Definitely. And Hanna, I imagine, social media must be vital to you in terms of how you find new jobs and kind of connect with other people. So I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that as well.
I think so I have a shop that I sell some of my illustration work in, and that I can definitely see that a lot of the sales come from social media. With work, I actually find word of mouth is the number one source of my work, which I think I'm lucky in some ways. I think what social media can be quite useful for, though, is it sort of reminds people that I exist and what I do. So I quite often will get an email from someone I've worked with before saying, spotted that you're doing this thing. Would you be interested in doing that for us? Or sometimes even, 6 months later, I remember you did this thing for so-and-so. Do you mind doing it, for us instead? And so I think just having that presence and talking about your work is really, really important as a freelancer, even if it doesn't necessarily even if it isn't the one way that people are finding you.
Yeah, definitely helps. So we've just had a comment come up. It's for you, Lisa. Earlier you were talking about your career path and you sadly got cut off. I think the last thing you were talking about was kind of, so yes, your advisor suggesting that you go into education in museums. And then what was the story from there, going from that to what you do now?
Yes, apologies for getting cut off. It's typical that it would happen during a live stream of YouTube, but hey ho, that is life sometimes. So thank you, Sophie, for asking that. So yes, my advisor, she'd suggested working in museums. So like I said, I went off to do my museum studies at University Leicester, and it really was an eye-opener. I absolutely loved doing the masters there, and I was fortunate that I could focus on education within museums for a good chunk of that master's degree as well, and that's what I did my dissertation in, and that did confirm for me that was the world that I wanted to enter. And then towards the end of the masters, we had to do a work placement, but for me, it timed with also getting a job at the Herbert. So I've not been here this whole time. That was back in 2000, and I've lost track of the years now. 2010 that was, and I got a job here at the Herbert on the learning team covering somebody's maternity post. So that ended up double-siding as my work placement as well for my masters. And then I stayed on the team for 4 years doing various things. So at one point I was the science and arts learning officer, then I became an outreach learning officer, and I was dipping in and out as well of doing schools and families. So for kind of 4 years it was a hat of many kinds whilst working on the team. And and then I ventured off to go and work in Birmingham museums for 4 years, and then I came back to the Herbert 6 years ago. So it's kind of been quite the path of dancing between different museums, but it was lovely returning here. And when I did return, we were a much bigger organisation because we'd teamed up with the Transport Museum as well, and I've never looked back, to be honest. I think there are definitely pros to working in a museum. It's so varied. The experiences are just utterly unique, and it's fun. You know, it's so much fun. There's no denying that. Yes, there's a lot of hard work and headaches that go along with it, but the fun definitely leads the way. Downside is it doesn't pay quite as well as that teaching career I had once imagined I would be going down, and that is the warning that I give anybody who openly asks me, you know, because being on the learning team, we do get asked it, particularly by students, a lot of, oh, what should I go into, teaching in a museum or teaching in a school? And I think it comes down to how they see their career going. I think it's quite difficult to climb up the ladder within museums. There's not many jobs there. The pay is not great at all. So it's definitely letting your passion for the subject and the work itself to lead the way. But that just comes down to everybody's personal circumstances.
Yes, definitely. And so it's quite normal of sort of the people in universities to end up bouncing around to get promotions. That sounds like it's similar in the museum sector, that you'll end up working for lots of different museums rather than kind of getting promoted within one. Would you say that's kind of the normal way people go about it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is a bit of a pattern that we've kind of joked about within museums before, that people tend to stick at a job for about 4 years before they move on to the next thing. You know, if they're not settled and happy with what they're doing, and if they do want to progress and gain new experiences, the sad reality is that a lot of museum work is often contract work as well. So you're not always on a permanent contract. There's a lot of fixed term contracts that have been floating around for many a year, and they still exist today. So we've got a bit of a 50-50 split at Culture Coventry, where some people are on permanent contracts, but others are on fixed term of either 2 years or 3 years or less, depending on what projects they've been employed for and how they're funded as well. Because, you know, there's different funding pots for different jobs within the organisation. And I think in the museums world, even when you're on a permanent contract, which feels, you know, like a luxury sometimes, permanent in museums never means permanent, because the amount of restructures that come along with budget cuts sadly are far too frequent. And I do think it's important that people have those realities in place if they are considering a career in a museum. And that's not to put anybody off, because like I say, it's wonderful, but it's not something where there's just endless jobs available, and it can be quite hard. We have a lot of very overqualified people, to be honest, on 0-hour contracts at the moment, and sadly, you know, it's a bit more of a political subject and debate that I won't go into on here, but it is the way of the world, and a lot of people sign up to those 0-hour contracts in order to gain the experience required to then step into a more substantial and longer term post.
Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting challenge, I think, across both sectors, really. Okay, so could we have a talk about what skills do you think you have that make you good at your career? I don't know, shall we start with you, Lisa? What do you think are the kind of key skills that mean you're able to kind of do your job?
Being creative, definitely. Particularly working in the learning and engagement team, we're forever having to come up with new ideas and to find fun and creative ways to engage people with the collections, whether that's art collections or social history collections. You know, our work with children, with families, with school groups, and even with adults too, it's about approaching it through a creative way and thinking outside of the box, and creating, you know, a unique experience that will have a long lasting memory, but also multitasking and organisation. And I honestly cannot champion that enough, because without those two skills, it just does become impossible, because we're never just doing one thing. We're forever juggling multiple projects, multiple events, multiple activities. And if you can't keep them in check and keep them organised, then it will all crumble. And, you know, there's a lot at stake there. So yeah, they're some of the key skills that are involved in my particular line of work.
Sounds great. Peter, do you want to go next? What are the key skills in your role?
I think it would be terrible if I didn't immediately say being a good communicator in my particular role, but that means being able to take what's potentially very technical, very complicated, very unusual language, topics, etc., and translating them for a very broad audience. Which I think is another skill that people need to be aware of. Appreciation of the audience as well. Remembering that if you have a complicated piece of engineering research to promote, for example, it's not going to appeal to everybody. And in order to get that covered in the media, you're going to have to present it in a way that the media will want it for their particular audience. So understanding how this particular story will appeal to someone, who it will appeal to, it's very much about stepping outside of your own kind of your own box, as it were, and thinking about other people, how they would view it, what they would see as exciting about this particular piece of news. The other thing is, of course, being able to handle things under pressure as well. Because as in the nature of a press officer is that you are very much at the whims of the news agenda. You never know, from one day to the next, you don't know if you're going to be the center of the media lens that day, or whether it's whether it's going to pass you by. And when that media lens is on you, then you are going to be rushing around. You're going to be trying to grab people for interviews. You may be organising film crews on sites, etc. You're going to have to think on your feet and make some very, very snap decisions. Do a lot of negotiating in a lot of cases. So it's also about being able to take that kind of take that pressure and be able to to work with some quite hard deadlines and quite. And like I say, quite a lot of pressure behind you, and yes, but the communication is the key thing, though. The one thing that I think a lot of people overlook sometimes is that just because you yourself may see may find something extremely exciting, may find a particular story very exciting, that doesn't mean that it's going to be exciting to everybody. So in many ways, being able to step away from that and think about, who are the different people who'd like to hear about this, and what do they want to know out of it? What matters to them? That is a key part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think having that kind of empathy with our audiences is really important for what we do as well. Rachel, do you want to go next? What are the key skills to being an academic, and one that does engagement in particular?
Probably exactly the same as Lisa and Peter. So organisational skills, so that you can make sure you've got the time to squeeze this in among all the other things that need doing, and communication, being able to take these complex ideas and explain them to different groups. And then for the things like standing up in front of large groups of people, you might think that you need to be some sort of extrovert to be able to do that, and you don't. What you need is passion. So if you're a complete introvert like I am, you can still do it, because if you've got passion for your subject, then that comes across and it gets people engaged in what you're talking about and involved in it.
Definitely. And there's so many different ways of doing engagement that even if you think I could stand up in front of 1,000 people and give a exciting, passionate Christmas lecture, there's still lots of kind of other ways that you can engage people with your subject and what you're passionate about, aren't there?
Yeah.
Okay, Hannah, what are the skills that are important for what you do?
I think a lot of them have already been mentioned, but I will just second what Rachel said and be like, I think it might be a Mark Twain quote that the only public speaker who isn't nervous is a liar. but I think that's very true. Like, and especially having worked on really high profile science festivals with some very big names, a lot of them are terrified before they get on stage in front of 1,000 people, but they do it anyway. And I think that's definitely so. I think anyone can become at least decent public speaker if they want to, and with practice. I think related to a lot of what people have said about communication, being able to sort of take technical information and turn that into something accessible is really important. But I'd add being able to ask questions when you don't know, especially when working with academics, working on festivals, things like when we the podcast I do and we have guests, it's actually being able to say, sorry, could you explain that another way? Or I didn't quite understand what you said. And that, I think, is a skill that takes quite a lot of practice to get better at. And then also that organization side, you know, for me, that comes across not just with the project management and the event management I do, but then being a freelancer, it's so important each and every day for sort of balancing finances, different clients' needs, making sure you know exactly when people need things by and how all the different deadlines slot together. I always say sort of loving spreadsheets a little bit is probably a very important thing.
Yeah, learning Excel, I'd say, is a really good thing to do, definitely. Okay, we've got another question from Sophie, which is for Hanna this time. So I'm going to put this on the screen. So I think we've touched on this slightly, but I guess from the perspective of being a freelancer, what are the biggest challenges?
I think there's two main ones. The first is financial. So it's my income is unpredictable. I sometimes don't really know what I'm going to be earning in 3 months' time compared to sort of the upcoming month. And that is tough. I think there are ways around that, and lots of people find different ways around that. So the general advice before you go freelance is to have 6 months of living expenses saved up. I know some people who've gone down that route. I know others who've gone down the route of having a part-time job, or sometimes even a full-time job, whilst doing, you know, building up their freelance portfolio alongside that. I'm quite open that I was very lucky that I was able to move back in with my parents when I first went freelance, and that was a massive, massive help for me. But I don't think it's the only way to do it. And that. The longer I've been freelance, I do slowly start to see a pattern to my work, though, which does make that a bit easier. So a lot of my work is either with universities or with organizations that work with the academic year as well. And so every August and September, the inquiries and the incoming work just drops completely. And it's easy to panic, but it always starts to come back again. And Christmas is another time where, you know, I think even a few weeks into January, everyone's sort of slowly catching up and not really thinking too far ahead. And then again, things do catch up. The other challenge can be just motivation. You have to motivate yourself. There is no one else necessarily there to help. And it can also be sort of on a related note, it can be a bit lonely because you are working by yourself most of the time. But saying that, I love freelancing. I wouldn't have it any other way. I truly do hope that I can stay a freelancer for as long as possible. The flip side of sort of everything I've said is that there is a lot of freedom. You know, as long as I get my work done, as long as I'm productive, it's up to me how I do it. I can, you know, especially it feels very sort of relevant this week as the clocks go back and the evenings are going to get darker, that I can down tools and go for a walk at 3 o'clock if I want, and then come back and work a little bit later. And that sort of flexibility for me is very, very important.
Thank you. I think that was a very nice insight. Okay, have we got any last questions from people watching online? If not, I'm just going to ask everybody to finish up with what if you could give kind of one piece of advice to people who are thinking about pursuing a career similar to yours, what would it be? So I'm going to say, Peter, do you want to start?
So I think I started off the session with this piece of advice, and it always bears repeating, which is get that work experience in. however you can. And I will say this partly as a press officer, but also as someone who's worked with people who've gone on to become journalists as well. It's the same advice across the board. Get on your student newspaper, volunteer for local community newsletter. See if you get onto your local BBC radio station or whatever. Just about everybody I've seen who's gone on to be a successful journalist or have great career as a press officer has usually built up that experience very early on by going out there and just doing the job as a journalist, just in a purely voluntary position. It's extremely valuable. It will set you up ahead of a lot of other people who haven't got that experience, and it's extremely valued by both us in press relations and those working on newspapers, because it tells us that you know how the industry works, you know the craft of communications, of pulling a story together, putting together a package, etc. And that's the most valuable thing to us.
Brilliant. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think getting work experience where you can is always good. And it can sometimes be hard. I know if you're trying to kind of balance having other jobs and kind of supporting yourself, that can be a real challenge for you. A lot of the time, particularly when we're looking for people to help with engagement events, we do try wherever we can to put out like paid work experience opportunities. So signing up to things like uni temps, that kind of thing, that can be a really good way of kind of getting a notification when we're looking for staff to help out. So that's kind of one option for getting experience with public engagement stuff.
But there's one thing that mistake people often tend to make with this, which is just to assume that. So, obviously speaking for our area particularly here, but to think to get experience as a journalist, you need to get onto a newspaper or get to a natural news outlet. No. As long as you are you are you're reporting on news on a regular basis, as I've said, things like community newsletters, for example, then it's fine. And one of the most important things is to kind of be able to step out of your comfort zone. It's nice if you see someone's got a blog, for example, blogging about some of their favorite subjects. But what we'd really like to see is if you are going out and blogging about something that's not in your comfort zone, because that's quite often what you will have to do in not just in communications, but in any engagement role. You may not necessarily be trying to get people to engage with something that's in your natural interests. So the more you can show that you can take this thing that you aren't actually interested in, but make it seem exciting, all the better from our perspective.
Thank you. Okay, does anybody else have any pieces of wisdom that they'd like to share with people?
My answer was going to be quite similar to Peter's about sort of trying stuff, but just to add to that, I'd also say never underestimate the transferable skills that you might have from other things that you've done. So because I worked out what I wanted to do a bit later, I'd spent a lot of my degree doing amateur dramatics, so directing, producing, set designing. And actually, that is one of the biggest things I ended up talking about in so many of my job interviews when I came out of uni, and actually even sort of years later, because having produced a play on a shoestring budget is the sort of thing that, working in events has so many skills, whether that's, budgets, organizing, trying to wrangle actors into rehearsal times, all of those skills. And then similarly, my first job, which was in a medical charity, was on paper a very admin focused role, but I learned a lot from doing that admin. And because it was a small charity, I managed to pick up a lot of experience within it. So writing blog posts for the organization, going and speaking to schools, writing for industry publications, sort of all sorts of things, whilst being paid the whole time, because I could not have afforded then to have done much voluntary work. So I think one thing I would say is, especially for those who have caring responsibilities, health issues, anything that's going to sort of reduce the amount of time and energy you have, you can find your own way and your own pace to get sort of different bits of experience here and there.
Definitely. Rachel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. If you're interested in going out and seeing what doing all these sorts of events and things is like, see what your department is up to for outreach and engagement, and offer to come and help us, because we always love having extra people coming in. And sometimes there are things like student ambassador roles that are paid.
Thank you. And Lisa, any last words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, similar to what other people said, the experience is absolutely key, and building up that early experience. So, you know, here at the museums, we've got plenty of volunteering opportunities across the board, really, with different areas, but particularly with the engagement work that we do. But like I said, I mentioned that we have the casual learning assistant role, which is a 0-hour contract. We usually recruit for that on a yearly basis around the summertime. So it's worth looking out for that, because for students in particular who are just trying to build up their portfolio, their experience, it is a good way in. And what we've often found in the past, the downfall of most people when it comes to recruiting for engagement-based roles, is the practical things in terms of understanding about risk assessments and fire safety and capacity of room, you know, all the logistics that are often overlooked because there's so much focus on the creativity and making those memorable experiences and the ties to the collections. But actually there's a lot of practicalities that need to go in behind it, and just having working knowledge of why risk assessments are so important you know, is a real key thing for us, and safeguarding, you know, and all of those sorts of things. And that's where doing a bit of early work experience or even time volunteering in events and activities, it's amazing how quickly you build up that knowledge because you're living and breathing it. So yeah, if anybody is interested in getting some experience in museums, by all means reach out.
Okay, thank you. And then just to finish off, so I've got a little evaluation form that I'm going to just put a link to in the chat. For those watching, if you'd mind filling this in for us, we'd really appreciate that. And then Hannah's just, you've got a science communication course coming up soon as well, don't you?
Yes,
so
I do.
Give that a little plug.
Yeah, thanks. So myself and 2 other science communication freelancers are launching a course called Science Communication Beyond the Basics, which is starting in a few weeks' time and runs for 6 weeks this side of Christmas and 6 weeks after Christmas. And if you go to globalscienceshow.com, there's a lot more information there.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think that is everything from us. Please do follow us on social media. If you search for us, just Warwick Engages. We're on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And yeah, do stay in touch with us moving forward. Thank you very much for coming.